Chapter 6. "Lovely car," said Mel. "Is it Mr. Chappell's?" Harker, sitting next to her in the leather and walnut back seat of the Jaguar, nodded. "We need to talk." He pressed a button and a glass screen rose between them and the driver. Mel shook her head. "If you're planning to enlist my help in your shady business dealings, you've got another think coming," she stated flatly. Harker laughed. It did nothing to reassure Mel. "For Christ's sake, Melanie, you're already involved. Or have you forgotten what you were doing last night?" Mel felt herself starting to blush. Harker was right. And not only had she illegally hacked into Chappell's files, but she had become so carried away with her own cleverness at interpreting the computer language that she had virtually debugged the whole thing at one sitting, without the faintest idea as to the true nature of the Codex project, or the slightest care as to the circumstances. For all she knew, she might have just helped a couple of mad businessmen in their attempts to defraud the world's banking systems. Considering the circumstances under which she had first met the doctor, that would be horribly ironic. "Are you planning a fraud?" she asked meekly. "What a question," he responded, and then he shrugged. "That's what I need you for. Chappell's up to something big, and from what I've been able to find out, he's going to siphon billions out of the stock markets when the year changes over." Mel's eyes widened. "He's going to use the century change to get into the stock markets? That's outrageous." And then she frowned. "And despicable. I won't help you," she stated, crossing her arms defiantly. Harker shook his head. "Either you help me, or I hand you over to the police. The penalty for information incursion is 20 years, remember?" Mel didn't remember, because that particular piece of legislation hadn't come into force when she had left Pease Pottage. And then something else occurred to her. "But if you're working for Mr. Chappell, why did you want me to break into his files?" "Because Chappell is deliberately keeping me in the dark," he barked. "One research team is working on a totally new computer language. The other is coding up designs that they don't understand." "But you're head of development," she pointed out. "I thought you were in charge of the programmers." "In charge of keeping them working, yes. But Chappell never saw fit to let me in on his plans, and he expects me to follow him blindly," he spat. "The only reason I know as much as I do is from the occasional system design that I've come across. And that's where you come in. We're going back to ACL, where Chappell is very keen to meet you. And when he's finished, you're going to carry on where you left off. You're going to dig out everything from that Codex directory that you can find, and then we're going to interpret it." He held up the slip of paper. "I mean, if you can crack into one of the most closely guarded program libraries in the whole computing industry, I'm sure deciphering a new language won't be beyond your abilities." As the car sped through Chiswick, Mel suddenly glanced at her watch and realized that it was 11 o'clock. The doctor and that woman would just have reached Canary Wharf Tower. The rest of the journey would take approximately another 3/4 of an hour, just enough time for them to finish their snooping around. She turned to Harker and smiled. "Fine, I'll help you. But not if we run into the doctor first." "Chappell seems to have a very odd view of business," said the doctor. After meeting at the railway station within the tower itself, they had made their way to the red marble foyer and received permission from the security guard to use the lift up to the 49th floor, the floor where Ashley Chappell Marketing was based. Anne looked away from the lift indicator as it changed from 45 to 46. "Ashley Chappell has an odd view of everything, Doctor. Is there some particular aspect of his megalomania which worries you?" She knew that her bitterness had spilt over into her reply, but that was unavoidable, really. He stroked the blue-black cat badge on his lapel. "He closes the development part of ACL, apart from his advanced research team, of course, and yet the sales force is kept on. Odd, wouldn't you say?" Anne shrugged. "Different parts of the great and glorious Ashley Chappell Holdings Corporation. I'm sure he'll dispense with them as soon as they become surplus to requirements." She calmed down slightly. "Floors 46 to 50 house most of his other companies, from the Ashley Chappell Lottery Consortium to the remains of ACL, apparently called Fantasy Lab Limited now." At that moment, the lift reached the appointed floor, and the single door opened with a ping, revealing the plushly furnished sales floor. Every single salesperson span round and stared at the new arrivals, before looking at one another in mild panic. I can't say I'm impressed by their sales technique, muttered the doctor archly, before striding from the lift and throwing his arms open. Good morning, he announced. Anne found herself staring at her shoes, hiding her embarrassment from the shocked staff. Can I help you, sir? Asked a woman in her late 20s, dressed in the blue suit that marked her as a member of Ashley Chapel's uniform public face. She was blonde, dyed blonde, Anne noted, with far too much makeup and a very tarty short skirt. The doctor gestured towards the nearest table, a reproduction Chippendale upon which sat a top-of-the-range tablet, waiting patiently to demonstrate any or all of ACL's software. I'm interested in buying something. The woman couldn't help pulling an exasperated look, as if to say, why else would you be here? But her reply was polite to the point of obsequiousness. Of course, sir, she said through bright red lips. Did you have a particular area in mind? Single workstation, client server, local or wide area network? She fired the jargon words as though she had learnt them by rote, with no idea of the meaning or significance beyond the training manual. Which was probably true, Anne mused. For all the expensive trappings of this prime site sales office, the cheapest part of the operation was the sales staff. Another reason for ACL's decline, she didn't doubt. The doctor laid a hand on the tablet. All of it and everything. T'd like to see every bit and bite that Ashley Chapel has to offer. Anne caught the smile from the woman and could see her excitement. Given the appalling sales record that ACL software possessed, this was probably the first time she had ever put her training into practice. Anne walked over to the doctor's side to watch. 10 minutes later, the sales assistant was enjoying a well-earned cup of coffee in the staff room. Within 2 minutes, the doctor's skill with the tablet, accompanied by his loud theatrical commentary, had succeeded in totally upsetting the woman. She was on the point of tears before she diplomatically withdrew, suggesting that the doctor would be better off trying out the software without her interference. He had cracked his knuckles and given a wicked grin. Now we can begin, he muttered to Anne. And now she was feeling as left out as the saleswoman, as she watched the doctor's dexterous fingers play the tablet like a musical instrument. Sometimes he would use both hands on the keyboard and ignore the mouse. On other occasions he would control the keyboard with one hand and maneuver the mouse with the other, tutting over the results on the screen as he did so. And every single one of Anne's inquiries was met with a knowing smile or a secretive tap on his nose as he navigated through the software. Anne's attentions were wandering, towards the coffee and biscuits provided in the hope of customers that beckoned from a distant table, when the doctor exhaled a sigh of delight. There, he hissed, pointing at the screen. To Anne, the display of windows was no different from any of the other tablet monitors placed around the sales floor, but the doctor's excitement indicated otherwise. What am I supposed to be looking at? She asked, hoping that the doctor might explain. Despite her grounding as a scientist, she wasn't as up-to-date with computer technology as she should have been. The doctor was only too pleased to oblige. To anybody lacking my particular talents, the network to which these tablets are connected is isolated from both the computers in ACL and the computer systems which control this tower. But I had my suspicions. The little that you've told me about the esteemed Mr. Chapel made it hard for me to believe that he wouldn't have some method of overseeing what happens with these machines. You found a link? Exactly, he said proudly, as if Anne were a slow pupil finally getting the correct answer. A one-way link between the ACL network and here. But if it's one way... That's where my genius comes in, he said proudly. And Anne realized that there was no trace of conceit in his words. He considered his inestimable intelligence as a proven fact, and everything and everyone simply had to operate around it. Indeed, reversing the direction of such a link is the key to undermining Chapel's paradigm operating system. He tugged on his cravat. At least, that's what I told Demeter Glaus when she was writing her book. Obviously realizing that he had completely lost Anne, he returned to the subject in hand. This is what my earlier display of genius has unearthed. This window controls the security systems for the whole of Canary Wharf Tower. Security systems? She asked. Why would you want to tamper with them? Because, Anne, there are limits to even my abilities. The link doesn't have the bandwidth necessary for me to access Chapel's research project. He indicated a nondescript grey-bordered window. I can see it, but I can't touch it. The link could never carry the amount of information that I want to look at. I need to get into ACL if I'm to proceed any further. He started entering data into the security window. So, what are you doing now? I'm instructing this magnificent glass edifice to let down its drawbridge at 3 o'clock tomorrow morning, when everything's nice and quiet. No. Anne's outburst drew alarmed looks from both the staff and the doctor. Anne, he hissed, after all that you've told me about ACL, I can't see that a little breaking and entering would prick your conscience. It's not that. It's just that, well, I think Chapel's going to make his move at midnight. Whatever he's up to, my sources are pretty certain that he's chosen 12 o'clock tonight to make his move. 3 o'clock could be too late. She hoped that that would convince him. She still couldn't bring herself to confess her true fears. Midnight, eh? Oh dear. It sounds like Chapel is one of those melodramatic villains, always trying to hog the limelight with their cleverness and theatricality. He sighed. How does 2,300 hours suit you? That gives me an hour to spare, should I need it. His tone suggested that he wouldn't. She smiled. That sounds fine. As the doctor typed away on the keyboard, something suddenly occurred to Anne. Why go to all this bother? She wondered. Why can't you use your TARDIS? The doctor didn't look up from the screen. Because there are some odd disturbances in the space-time continuum around here. He trailed off and stared into the distance, and Anne could have sworn that a look of sheer horror flashed across his face. He regained his composure, but a faint flicker of unease was still present. Perhaps I might need the extra time, he murmured. You still haven't told me how we're going to get to see Chapel, said Barry. He and Louise were standing outside Canary Wharf Tower, braving the chilly December morning. Thanks to a temporary power failure on the Docklands Light Railway, they had been forced to take the bus. Without our ID cards, the lifts won't work. Louise raised a finger. That's where my superior intellect comes in, she said brightly. The lift is controlled from the security desk. Barry shot her a puzzled frown. So? Vincent's hardly going to risk his job to let us back into ACL, is he? He still works for Chapel, remember? And that's where you come in, she said, waiting for a motorcycle courier to speed past before she crossed the road. Me? Barry hurried to catch up with her. What have I got to do with it? They reached the glass doors, and Barry realized with a shudder that Vincent had seen them and was grinning broadly. There was no going back. Vincent likes you. Barry instantly understood what she meant. Oh, no, he shouted, just because he fancies me. I'm not going to take advantage of him. I'm not asking you to sleep with him, she protested. Just flirt a bit. Say that you've left something behind, that sort of thing. But... Louise span round and jabbed him in the chest with a well-aimed finger. You bloody hypocrite! It was okay for me to try it on with poor old James, but when it's your turn, ooh, you really get my back up sometimes. Barry refrained from pointing out that trying it on with James had actually been her idea, and that his unfortunate demise had made it rather moot anyway. Louise was now set on this course of action, and anything he said would only make her more resolute. All right. Anything for a quiet life. He stepped forward, allowing the automatic doors to open. As they entered the foyer, they didn't notice the dark blue Jaguar driving up Canada Square. Chapel checked his watch yet again. Harker was taking his time bringing clever Miss Bush back to ACL, and Chapel didn't like his people to slack on the job. Sitting down at his desk, he worked at his tablet for a few seconds, and then smiled as a video window appeared. The window was tapping into the monitor feed from the foyer of the tower. And then his smile vanished, to be replaced by an incredulous stare. After the events of the previous evening, there were two people that Chapel had never expected to see again. So what the hell were Mason and Brown doing talking to the security guard in the foyer? Either they were extremely brave or extremely stupid. And Chapel was forced to admit that, however badly it reflected on his recruitment process, the latter was probably true. But the last thing he currently wanted was a personal confrontation with them. So, despite his discomfort, there was only one option open to him. He would have to sit and watch, and hope that the security guard did his job for once. "Hiya," said Vincent cheerfully, his pleasure at seeing Barry again written all over his face. What brings you back here? Barry smiled back. It's a bit, well, embarrassing, really. You know how upset I was yesterday? So what? Shrugged Vincent. You'd just been made redundant. You were entitled to be a bit down. Barry adopted his most persuasive tone. Thanks. You've always been so understanding. It's just that I left something in my desk and I was wondering... Sorry, Vincent replied curtly. No one's allowed back into the ACL suite apart from Mr. Chappell, Mr. Harker and the advanced research team. Not even you. Laying it on a bit more heavily, Barry steeled himself and gently brushed Vincent's huge, hairy hand. I only want to slip in and slip out, he whispered, fully intending the double entendre. It won't take a second. I'm sorry, Barry, but I've got my instructions. It's my job on the line. And then he grinned. But if you're not busy later, I'm going to a really good party. You could meet some friends of mine. Barry snatched his hand away. Bloody hell, I only want to pop back to my desk. That doesn't give you the right to make a pass at me. He immediately realized how hurtful that had sounded, and that Vincent was exactly that. Hurt and angry. Is that what all of this was about? He shouted. Flirt a bit with Vincent and he'll let us back into ACL? You really are a nasty piece of work, aren't you? God knows why I was ever interested. Hold on a minute, Louise interjected. There's no need to get worked up about this. No need, no need. I might be just a security guard, he replied, and I might not have the qualifications necessary to become a programmer or a technical author, but I'm still a person. Louise laid her hand on his arm, but Vincent threw it off. And you're just as bad as he is. Hang on, snapped Barry. Don't start taking it out on her. I should have guessed, barked Vincent. I should have guessed that you'd stand up for her. He grabbed Barry by his collar. Are you sure that everything's all right? The look of fear on the doctor's face was an image that Anne couldn't get out of her mind, even now in the mirrored lift. Yes, perfectly, he replied, but he sounded distracted, worried. I wonder how Mel is faring in her investigations, he added, injecting a note of enthusiasm into his voice. Such a headstrong young lady. He stopped as the lift reached the ground floor and the doors opened, and Anne stared at the scene in front of them in surprise. A man and a woman were arguing with one of the security guards, drawing everyone's attention away from the external doors opposite the lift, where a blue Jaguar was parked outside. Chappell's car! Anne hissed. I can't let him see me here. She felt the first stirrings of panic and started looking for some means of escape that would avoid the object of her hatred. And then the doctor's voice cut through her desperation. It can't be, he whispered. Anne recognized the man getting out of the car before she noticed the woman with him. The large, unfriendly shape of David Harker, Chappell's trained gorilla, made her shudder. And then she noticed that one massive hand was grasping the shoulder of somebody else she recognized. Of all the infernal cheek, snapped the doctor indignantly. They've kidnapped Mel. Almost pulling Anne out of the lift, he strode towards the main doors, obviously intending to confront Harker face to face. But Anne managed to hold him back. No, Doctor! But her words were drowned out by the commotion around the security desk. Raised voices had given way to raised fists as the man with light brown hair was being held back from hitting the guard by the blonde woman. The few dozen people in the foyer were now gathered round the fracas, blocking the route from the doors to the lift as they tried to see what was going on. And then Anne realized that the doctor was no longer standing next to her. He was threading his way through the onlookers, but Anne could see that he wasn't aiming towards the protagonists. Instead, he was heading towards the point where Harker and Mel would come closest to the fracas. As he drew near, he turned to Anne and gestured for her to get away. The next few seconds were a blur to Anne. As she scurried towards the doors on the other side of the foyer, the other side of the tower from where Chappell's car was parked, she caught a glimpse of the doctor elbowing one of the crowd, forcing them to collide with Harker. And then Mel's hair was clearly visible like a red beacon, moving away from Harker and away from the commotion. At the same time, the altercation seemed to peter out, as the blonde woman succeeded in dragging her friend away from the security guard and towards the doors. Anne left the tower and hurried round the outside, trying to ignore the cold wind that whipped past her. She waited on the corner, where she had a clear view of Chappell's Jaguar. Moments later, the doctor and Mel came through the doors and joined her. "Once again, the doctor comes to the rescue," he said proudly. "That fight had something to do with it, though," Mel pointed out, unaware of the doctor's sudden, crestfallen expression. "I wonder what that was all about." The very people who had apparently been responsible for the trouble in the foyer were walking past them, both looking very flustered. They looked over at the doctor, Anne and Mel, and then made to walk off in the opposite direction. "Not so fast," called the doctor. The words were so intense, so commanding, that the man and the woman stopped and turned round, both looking rather sheepish. From the antique splendour of his office on the 50th floor, Chapel watched the chaos in the foyer on the screen of his tablet with a sigh of irritation. In just over 12 hours it would be midnight, a midnight that he had been planning for, preparing for nearly 20 years. 2 decades of devoting his vast fortune to researches amongst the arcane, buying secrets and people in his quest to create what he now knew as the Millennium Codex. 2 decades, inexorably leading up to midnight on the 31st of December 1999. And yet the Codex was still flawed, still imperfect. He reached out to the compact black keyboard and played an elegant sequence, changing the image from the now calm foyer of Canary Wharf Tower to a listing of the one module left in the Codex that was still proving problematic. In the early hours of that morning, he had watched with anticipation as the serendipitous Ms. Bush had turned her attention to the C-ASIC module. Thanks to her programming legerdemain, it was the only part of the Codex left to fix. And 3 hours later, he had slammed the mahogany tabletop in frustration as a quick look through the library video feed showed that she had fallen asleep, leaving C-ASIC unfinished. C-ASIC was the key program, the one whose execution would initiate the cascade through the hundreds of other programs which comprised the Codex, the core of 20 years of research. And with the departure of Ms. Bush, Ashley Simon Iolanthe Chapel had just lost the one chance he had of making the deadline. The knock at the door distracted Chapel from the flawed code. "Come!" he yelled. There was an apologetic growl from the doorway. "Ah, David, do come in." Chapel's anger was barely restrained. "I take it you saw what happened," muttered the large man. "That you allowed Ms. Bush to escape?" He offhandedly waved at the tablet. And then his manner changed. "I had a ringside seat," he yelled, leaping to his feet. "That woman was our only hope of completing the Codex within the specified time frame, David, and you let her slip through your fingers. Thanks to you, the entire project is in jeopardy." He stopped as something occurred to him, something triggered by both his observation of Mel's techniques in the early hours and his recent visit to Holborn. When Mel had debugged the CWSDL module, she had used a very unexpected technique, a technique that might just work on C-ASIC. Opening a drawer in his desk, he withdrew a large but thin book, bound in faded beige. Thanks to his ownership of the Library of St. John, the restrictions concerning removal of books didn't apply to him, and he had walked out with 2 vital volumes. One was an account of the ancient god, Yog-Sothoth. The other purported to be a transcription of writings from the time of Atlantis. He opened it and leafed through the pages until he found what he wanted, a reproduction of an ancient inscription. An inscription written in the same language as the Millennium Codex. Sitting down, he began typing with increasing speed and vigour. Every few seconds he would stop and stare at the book and the inscription before returning his attention to the keyboard. "Ashley." Chapel didn't look up, but his anger had dissipated. "I see it now. I see the problem." A further minute of quiet keystrokes, and then he leant back in his plush leather chair and placed his hands behind his neck. "Ashley?" repeated Harker. Chapel looked at him through his glasses and broke into a broad grin. "I've done it, David. I've done it," he whispered, almost afraid to shatter the fragile, exquisite silence. He rose and walked over to the window, savouring the mid-morning view of the capital, a capital that was now ready to accept the word of Sarah Quazell and the glory and majesty that would accompany his ascension. The Millennium Codex is now complete, and although it pains me to admit it, the credit rests with our magnificent Ms. Bush, he said, turning from the window. She will receive her reward in heaven.